For nearly 3 centuries, one family was certain they knew where they came from. Parish registers, birth certificates, every scrap of paperwork, it all pointed to a single town. Then, when researchers were finally able to sequence their DNA, a different story emerged, one that had stayed hidden for almost 300 years, and completely upended everything the family thought they understood about their own origins. This is the story of how modern genetics cracked open one of genealogy's most stubborn mysteries, and along the way exposed just how shaky historical paperwork can really be, and just how much power science now has to uncover where we actually come from. We live in a world that trusts paper, certificates, ledgers, official stamps. We treat them as the final word on who we are and where our people began. So it comes as a jolt to realize that some of the deepest truths about our past were never written down anywhere. They live in our DNA instead. Genealogy has always drawn in the obsessive and the curious. Countless hobbyists and researchers have spent lifetimes hunched over brittle documents, deciphering cramped old handwriting, stitching together scraps of the past. They chase surnames through census rolls, trace land deeds across generations, and construct sprawling family trees, all resting on one core assumption, that the records themselves can be trusted. That a birth certificate naming a birthplace or a church ledger, naming a grandfather's hometown, reflects what actually happened, that assumption turns out to be far shakier than most people would like to admit. One case captures this especially well, a family with every reason to feel confident in their history. They had documents, they had paperwork stretching back generations. They had oral tradition lining up neatly with what was written down. Every thread pointed toward the same small village as their point of origin, except the records carefully preserved, widely trusted, were flat out incorrect. And this error might never have come to light if not for the rise of genetic testing in the early 2000s. Using DNA to trace ancestry is a fairly modern idea. Scientists understood DNA's structure as early as the 1950s, and DNA testing itself existed by the 1980s, but it took until the year 2000 for consumer-facing DNA testing to reach the public. That first wave of genetic genealogy companies met real skepticism. People doubted the science, worried about privacy, and some dismissed it outright as gimmickry. But as the technology matured and costs fell, and as more people sent in their samples, patterns started to surface. Connections that documents alone could never have revealed came into focus, and it became impossible to ignore how thoroughly genetic testing could confirm, challenge, or completely rewrite a family's understood history. One striking illustration comes from Megan Smoleniak, a longtime genealogist who turned her research tools on her own family. The Smoleniak surname is fairly rare, and years of careful digging had uncovered something that seemed almost too tidy to be true. Every Smoleniak alive today, spread from Ukraine to research stations in Antarctica, appeared to trace back to one tiny Slovak village, Ostrnia. Not merely the same country, the same village. The records went further. Still, registers from St. Michael's, Greek Catholic Church. The only church serving the village showed Smoleniaks occupying the exact same 4 houses across generations. Dating to the 1740s, houses numbered 88, 96, 103, and 135. It felt like a foregone conclusion. The documentation all pointed that way. Families living that close together over that long a stretch surely descended from someone in common. Then DNA testing became accessible, and Smoleniak decided to put the theory to the test. She had her own DNA analyzed and compared it against other tested Smoleniaks, essentially checking a premise genealogists had long treated as settled fact. The results were startling. Many people bearing the Smoleniak name People, the paper trail identified as close relations, all tracing to those same 4 households, turned out to be far less genetically connected to her than the documents implied. Some showed no meaningful genetic relationship at all, despite records listing them as cousins or even siblings. The long-accepted genealogical narrative was wrong, and in hindsight, this shouldn't have been so shocking. Living nearby, sharing a surname appearing together in the same records. At the same time, none of that guarantees a shared ancestor, people relocated, people married outsiders, clerks, mistranscribed names. Spelling varied, depending on who was writing phonetically. Births and deaths sometimes went unrecorded entirely. Children were occasionally registered under names different from their parents. Small mistakes piled up across centuries until the written record no longer matched the biological reality it was supposed to describe. This pattern keeps repeating across the genetic genealogy world. Amateur researchers and professionals alike keep discovering that their carefully built family trees don't hold up against what DNA reveals unknown half-siblings surface. People find out the parents who raised them aren't their biological ones. Ancestral lines traced back through dozens of generations turn out to be broken in multiple places. The paper trail that felt so authoritative is proving to be a lot less trustworthy than anyone hoped. So why are these records so error-prone? Once you look at how genealogical documentation was actually produced and kept over the centuries, the reasons make sense. Human error was constant. Clerks routinely misheard names, and a name that sounded right when spoken could be spelled very differently on the page 19th and early 20th century census takers. In many countries, didn't ask for supporting documents. They simply asked questions and wrote down the answers, sometimes given from faulty memory, sometimes altered on purpose. A young man might lie about his age to join the military. An unmarried mother might obscure details to avoid social judgment. Someone might claim the place they'd lived longest as their birthplace, even if it was accurate. The motives varied, but the outcome was consistent. Errors accumulated. Record-keeping quality also varied enormously by place and era. Switzerland has kept public records for more than 700 years. Iceland's genealogical archives are so thorough that many residents can trace their lineage back 30 generations. China preserved lineage records spanning roughly 2 millennia. Elsewhere, record-keeping was patchy, inconsistent, or simply absent. In the U.S., civil registration of births and deaths rolled out unevenly. Some regions kept detailed records from the 1800s, while others didn't start formal birth registration until the 1910s. Canadian census data has notable gaps. Australia actually destroyed portions of its early census records. Whole chapters of family history simply have no paper trail at all. Then there's the erosion caused by time itself. Handwriting styles shift. The same name gets transcribed differently across documents. Borders move, towns get renamed or absorbed into different countries, surnames evolve. First names get anglicized, nicknames eventually become the official name on paper. The deeper into history you dig, the more opportunities exist for something to go wrong. Perhaps, most fundamentally, these records were compiled by ordinary people, working with limited information and no way to verify what they were told. A priest recording a baptism in 1750 had no DNA test at his disposal. He couldn't confirm the child brought before him actually belonged biologically to the couple claiming him. He simply wrote down what he was told. If the true parentage differed through a hidden affair, a quiet adoption, or a case of mistaken identity, the priest had no way of catching it. The record preserved what people said, not necessarily what was true. This is exactly why the story of one family's 270-year genealogical mix-up carries so much weight. It's a vivid reminder that no matter how official or permanent a document appears, and no matter how confidently we accept what's written in it, the real story of our ancestry can be far messier, and sometimes wildly different from what the paperwork claims, and it underscores something else today. We have a tool no earlier generation possessed the ability to read the genetic code itself, and check the written record against biological fact. A remarkable example of this involves a German family and a finding so significant it reshaped how researchers think about long-term human continuity in one place. In 2007, a team at the University of Göttingen launched an ambitious experiment. They extracted DNA from ancient remains uncovered in a cave in Liechtenstein bones dated to roughly 1000 BC, about 3,000 years old. The site held the remains of around 60 individuals alongside bronze ornaments, pottery, and remnants of clothing apparently placed there as part of a ritual tied to beliefs about the afterlife. The Göttingen team wondered something bold: could living descendants of these Bronze Age people still be found nearby? They invited residents from surrounding villages to contribute saliva samples for testing. About 120 people took part, including a man named Manfred Hochstetter from the small village of Förste, not far from the burial cave. 9 months later, Hochstetter got a letter with an extraordinary result. His DNA matched the ancient remains from that cave. Not a loose or ambiguous match, a definitive one, indicating unbroken biological descent across roughly 120 generations and 3,000 years. The implications were staggering. The Hochstetter family hadn't simply lived near Förste. For a long while, they'd remained rooted in that same region for a full millennium before Christ was born, and for 3,000 years altogether. They had lived through the rise and collapse of the Roman Empire, through wars, plagues, famines, and every major upheaval Europe has seen, all while their bloodline stayed anchored to the same patch of land. Researchers stressed how rare this kind of continuity is. In a world defined by migration and upheaval, staying rooted in one place for 3 millennia is almost unheard of. Yet that's precisely what the genetic evidence showed: living proof that amid constant historical churn, some families simply never left. This connects directly back to the central story here. The Hochstetter case shows just how far DNA evidence can reach, establishing connections across time that no document could ever provide. There are no written records from 1000 BC, no family trees, No registries, nothing but bones and the genetic information locked inside them. And yet, genetic analysis pinned down lineage with total certainty. That same power reading the truth encoded in our genes is what allows faulty genealogical paperwork to be exposed and corrected. When DNA and documents disagree, it's the DNA that's telling the truth. Back to the mystery of the family, misled about their village of origin. For 270 years, their story shows how this kind of error takes root on a much smaller, more personal scale. Picture a family in the 1750s, maybe a clerical slip, a name change, or a transcription mistake, led to a record naming the wrong village as their point of origin. That record became official. Other documents cited it. Over time, the family itself came to accept it as simple fact. Generation after generation, the mistake got copied, referenced, and folded into family lore. Within 100 years, no one living remembered the actual original village. The written record had become the accepted truth. By the time 270 years had passed, an entire family believed something about their roots that was completely untrue. And there was no way to challenge it, because every available source consistent corroborating seemingly airtight said the same thing. That is, until DNA testing entered the picture. When someone in this family finally submitted a DNA sample, the results told a different story. The genetic markers pointed to an entirely different village, one that contradicted nearly 3 centuries of accepted family history. It was disorienting, even unsettling, but it was also accurate. And once genetic evidence lays out the truth, the original documentary mistake becomes obvious in hindsight. Somewhere along the way, a long-dead record keeper made an error, or perhaps deliberately altered the facts. Either way, for 270 years, this family had built their sense of identity on a mistake that had felt for all that time like unshakable fact. Cases like this keep multiplying as more people take DNA tests and as genetic databases keep expanding. Direct-to-consumer testing companies now hold tens of millions of genetic profiles between them, and as those databases grow, so does the ability to spot subtle genetic links across huge populations. Firms like Ancestry, Com23andMe, and MyHeritage maintain enormous genetic archives that researchers can mine to confirm or contradict what paper records claim. The result has been a surge of genealogical surprises that clash with documented history. It's now fairly common for people taking DNA tests to discover unexpected siblings, half-siblings, or distant relatives their paperwork never hinted at. It's not unusual to learn that a presumed biological parent isn't a genetic match at all. These revelations can sting, but ultimately they surface what actually happened, rather than what documents merely claimed happened. Consider the scale of the issue. If one family's records misidentified their home village for 270 years, how many other family histories carry similar errors around the world? How many people have inherited a mistaken understanding of their ancestral origins? Genealogists increasingly believe the number is enormous. The written record is nowhere near as dependable as people once assumed. This has real consequences for how we think about history, identity, and truth itself. Ours is a culture that leans heavily on paperwork. We trust official documents almost reflexively, assuming that anything recorded in a church register census or birth certificate must be accurate. DNA testing has shown that trust to be misplaced far more often than we'd like. Sometimes understanding where we truly come from means looking past the documents entirely and accepting that what we believed may simply be wrong. The story of a family misdirected to the wrong ancestral village for 270 years is a textbook example of this shift. For generations, no one thought to question the paperwork. It seemed to settle the matter for good. But science eventually revealed what those documents had obscured. In doing so, it didn't just fix one family genealogy. It illuminated something broader about the limits of documentary evidence and the nature of historical truth. None of this makes documents worthless. They remain essential to genealogical work, but it does mean they deserve healthy skepticism. Anyone starting to research their family history should assume the records they find may contain mistakes. Cross-check multiple sources. Watch for inconsistencies. And if DNA testing is an option, pursue it. Understanding the results might well contradict what the paperwork suggests. The genealogy field itself is adjusting to this new landscape. Professional genealogists now commonly recommend pairing documentary research with DNA testing, since genetic evidence can break through long-standing research. Dead ends surface unknown relatives and confirm or challenge inherited family stories. Combining traditional record-based genealogy with modern genetic science paints a far more accurate picture than either method could produce alone. This shift has also transformed how historical mysteries get solved more broadly. Cold cases have been cracked using genetic genealogy. Unidentified remains have finally been named. Descendants of enslaved people have been reconnected with ancestors through DNA in cases where documentation was thin or deliberately withheld. The reach of genetic evidence extends well past personal family history, and the possibilities keep expanding. As genetic databases grow, as AI helps process and interpret genetic data, and as researchers refine their analytical techniques, the ability to confirm, challenge, and correct genealogical claims will only get stronger. Families who've held certain beliefs about their ancestry for centuries may find those beliefs overturned. But that discovery comes with something valuable in return: the truth. The family whose records pointed to the wrong village for 270 years went through real disorientation upon learning the facts. Everything they thought they knew about their roots turned out to be mistaken, but they also gained something meaningful. They finally learned where they actually came from. In an era saturated with misinformation and unreliable narratives, discovering the truth about something as basic as your own ancestry is genuinely valuable. That's what makes this story matter. Not as a quirky genealogical footnote, but as proof that we now hold tools no previous generation had. We can read the code embedded in our own cells. We can test historical claims against biological reality. We can pursue the truth wherever it leads, even when it upends everything we assumed we knew. And sometimes that truth turns out to be more compelling, more surprising, and more worthwhile than any comfortable myth ever was. The DNA-driven transformation of genealogy is still just beginning. As testing becomes more widespread, as databases keep growing, and as analytical tools improve, we should expect even more striking discoveries, more families learning their records were wrong, more long-standing historical narratives challenged and rewritten, more evidence that the documented past is messier and stranger than we assumed. But that's not a reason for discouragement. It's a reason for wonder, because it proves the truth is still out there to be found, even after centuries of mistaken belief, even after generations built entire identities on faulty assumptions. We can still uncover what really happened. We can still find out where we truly come from. And that truth, the one written into our DNA, is worth every disruption it causes to what we thought we already knew. The family that spent 270 years believing they came from the wrong village finally knows the truth. And that truth held in their DNA is more solid than any document ever was.